Hi, this is video 2 on the menstrual cycle and the human reproductive systems. The menstrual cycle is a series of changes in the ovary and uterus that occur about every 28 days. This stops during pregnancy and during menopause. Menopause is a stage in life as a woman ages. Eventually her body ceases to continue to go through the menstrual cycle. So menstrual flow or menses stops during menopause, and that's for the duration of their life. So let's talk about the stages of the menstrual cycle, because for some people it is 28 days, some people it's less, some people it's more, some people it's completely irregular. It's really wonderful the way it works that way. The first stage is the follicle stage. And during the follicle stage, the ovaries produce estrogen and an egg matures in the follicle of the ovary. This can take up to 14 days. And then once that egg is mature, because of those hormones, all right, we'll find as we go through this, all of this is controlled by hormones. But the next thing that occurs is ovulation. So around day 14, the egg is going to be released from the follicle. And this is an average. So sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later. It is all controlled by hormones. You will be expected to know the role of the different hormones, but we're going to focus on those in our next slide. The third phase is the corpus luteum stage. And that particular phase is most notably identified by the existence of the yellow body. We call this the corpus luteum. It's the remaining follicle of where the egg has been expelled. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone from the polar bodies. Those polar bodies that were produced during meiosis happen to be a primary source, not the only source, but a primary source of progesterone that causes the lining of the uterus to thicken. And that's going to increase the vascularization or blood vessels during the last 12 days of the cycle. And that's going to be very important because, as we talked about in the previous class, one of the things that the fertilized egg needs is a place to implant. And if the uterus hasn't thickened, then there isn't going to be a suitable location for it to attach to. The fourth and final phase is only going to occur if the egg hasn't been fertilized. This is the menstrual phase, or menses as it's sometimes referred. Right? During the menstrual phase, the uterine lining breaks down and passes out of the vagina, and it lasts from anywhere from 4 to 7 days, depending on how lucky you are. And all of these rely on the follicle stimulating hormone, estrogen, and progesterone that are produced by the female body. So let's take a look at how this cycle looks in graphical form. I feel like these images are much more helpful in understanding the process. Many images are going to look for the breakdown of the endometrium or the menses. This is the menstrual phase, as the first days of the cycle. And that's primarily because it is an obvious visual indicator that the cycle is going through the stages. So the first 4 to 7 days are typically going to be identified as the menstrual phase. You'll see in here, you also have some levels of different hormones graphed here. These hormones can come from the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and you also have an image that shows the progress of the follicle during the stages. So you've got various images that show what's changing in the follicle, the image that shows changes in hormones, and you have images that show changes in the uterine thickness. The menstrual phase is the first 4 to 7 days. As menstruation ceases, you'll notice that estrogen levels start to rise. Estrogen levels rising are primarily a result of this development within the ovary. And estrogen levels are going to continue to rise, and you'll see there's a very important spike of LH. LH is luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone comes from the pituitary gland, and it causes the rupture of and release of the egg from the follicle. That immediately indicates the start of the last phase of the menstrual cycle, which is the luteal phase. And there's your luteal body, or the corpus luteum, and that's going to be producing the progesterone that causes the development and vascularization of the uterine wall. Okay, so let's look over at this side. All right, this particular image breaks down some characteristic body temperatures. You've got pituitary hormones, you have ovarian hormones, and you have the uterine cycle in this particular one. And sorry, you also see down here at the bottom, the different phases are identified. You have menses, or the menstrual phase. You have the follicular phase that comes after that. You have ovulation, which is that one moment in time when that egg is released. And then the remaining time is spent in the luteal phase until menses starts again, which is the breakdown of the uterine lining and release of the unfertilized egg. All right, so from the pituitary gland, there are two important hormones. LH, which is luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for the release of eggs. All right, and then you also have follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for developing that follicle. Now, males produce follicle stimulating hormone too, but follicle stimulating hormone in males causes the development of sperm cells. So FSH and LH both are secreted by the pituitary gland. Then you have estradiol, which is really just estrogen. All right. Estrogen levels are produced by the ovary, and progesterone produced by the ovary as well. Those levels of progesterone are highest during the corpus luteum phase, or luteal phase. Estrogen levels peak as the follicle is developing. All right, so estrogen is going to be primarily useful in helping to develop the follicle, and progesterone is going to be primarily useful in maintenance and development of the uterine lining. I think it's important that we recognize the roles of each of these hormones. So I'm just making a couple marks on here to help you with that. All right, so let's take a look at the next page. Because if the egg is fertilized, then instead of being eliminated during the menstrual phase, it will actually implant into the uterine wall or endometrium. There are a couple interesting phenomenon that we want to include in this. If the egg is fertilized, you can have identical twins, or if multiple eggs are released, you can have fraternal twins. At some point during the development of the zygote, as it's dividing, it will form two piles. If these piles separate, then you have genetically two piles that will continue to develop, and they're genetically the same, so they are identical twins. If, however, there are two separate zygotes, all right, then you're going to have two events of development occurring simultaneously. You'll get fraternal twins. Fraternal twins can be the same gender or they can be different gender. Identical twins are always going to be the same gender. All right, so there are 4 stages of embryonic development. Well, I mean, we could probably break it down more than that, but the fertilized egg is known as a zygote. And then we have the blastula, which is a hollow sphere, right? It's just a ball of cells that's hollow on the inside. Then you have gastrula, or the gastrulation, which is where instead of being hollow now, it pushes in on itself, creating a dimple. And that's called the blastopore. And this helps to form layers of cells. And I'm gonna take a second and I'm gonna point out those different layers. You have ectoderm, which is on the outside. You have endoderm, endo meaning like enter, it's on the inside. And then halfway in between, in the third layer, there's actually a third layer that's not shown here, but I have it on the next page. It's called the mesoderm, meso meaning middle. All this cell division is happening via mitosis. It's very important that you remember the only time meiosis occurs is the production of the sperm and egg that were present prior to fertilization. So you have the egg and you have the sperm, all right? Those were produced by meiosis. They fuse, and then you get the zygote. From here on out, it's going to be almost exclusively mitosis. All right, so cleavage. Cleavage is mitotic cell division. Like a cleaver, you can cut something in half, right? And that's exactly what happens to every cell as this divides and goes through cleavage. It's going to be producing double the number of cells in each division. That's mitosis. It gets you to the blastula phase, and that blastula was the ball, if you think of it that way. It's a hollow ball. And then you have gastrulation, which is when that ball folds in, and it gets you the 3 layers of the tissue that are going to develop in your body. So as these differentiation is just a fancy term because all these cells that start out are what we call stem cells. Now, stem cells you've probably heard before because there's a lot of talk about that in genetics and research. They are cells that haven't become a certain type of tissue yet. They're not skin, they're not hair, they're not bone, they're not muscle. They can become anything. They're unprogrammed, all right? Differentiation is the idea that the cells become programmed as certain tissue. Right? So that is, it's a one-way street. Typically, once a cell becomes a certain type of cell, it's not, you can't go back. All right. Embryonic layers are going to differentiate into different tissues, organs, and systems based on this general pattern shown here below in this chart. So cells of the ectoderm, which are the outer light blue area, right? Those will become the nervous system. So it's going to form your brain, your spinal cord, your nerves. It's going to form your skin, hair, and nails. The mesoderm, which is the middle area, right? I can't even tell what color the mesoderm is shown there. It looks kind of orangey to me. But mesoderm is going to become the muscles, circulatory system, the skeleton, excretory system, the reproductive system, all developed from that mesoderm pile of cells in the middle here. And then the endoderm is going to become almost exclusively the digestive and respiratory system, and then it's going to form the liver and the pancreas. Cell growth versus body growth. It's important that you understand that growth can be described as either an increase in cell size or cell numbers. And there is certainly a limit on how big a cell can become. So it's once a cell gets to a large enough size, it has to divide in order to survive, because diffusion just won't be able to make it through the entire thickness or width of the cell in order to meet its needs. So let's take a look at the development that occurs after fertilization. Prenatal development is before birth. So fertilization and cleavage occur in the oviduct. Cleavage, remember, is the division of the cells. Gastrulation is the folding in of that ball of cells, and that occurs after the embryo has implanted in the uterus. So it's already made it down into the uterus, and it has embedded itself into the endometrial wall or the uterine wall. The placenta is the organ where the exchange of nutrients goes from mother to embryo. It's very important that you understand that the mother's blood and the baby's blood are separate. They don't typically mix. There is the potential for some mixing during childbirth, but mom's blood and baby's blood are separate. The placenta and the uterine wall grow together in a very well-developed set of capillaries for the exchange of nutrients between mom and baby. What that means is any nutrients, medications, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, all those materials that are in the blood supply of the mom are going to diffuse through the capillaries of the uterus, and they're going to end up in the blood supply of the baby. That is most pertinent when you start looking at fetal development later on in term, because so much material is going to be delivered to the baby to maintain its development. The umbilical cord is responsible for transporting materials in the blood supply of the baby. So the baby's heart pumps the blood out through the umbilical cord into the blood vessels of the placenta. Now, where you and I, we pump blood from our heart to our lungs for gas exchange, the baby pumps blood to the placenta where it gets oxygen and eliminates carbon dioxide. Where we pump blood to our digestive system, the digestive system is the nutrients from the digestive system of the mom are transported to the blood of the placenta and are returned to the heart and then circulated around the body of the baby for it to develop. The fetus is surrounded by the amniotic sac, which is filled with fluid, amniotic fluid. That fluid is a shock absorber. It surrounds the baby. The baby swallows and actually inhales this amniotic fluid. So it does fill all the body cavities. The baby doesn't, its lungs are not fully developed and they are filled with fluid. When the baby is born after birth, the baby's lungs will be cleared out quickly and fill with oxygen. The gestational period of humans is approximately 9 months. Now, in reality, it's more like 10 months, but the first month you don't realize you're pregnant because it's just a fertilized egg. All right. And so then the next month, over the course of the next month, this egg has implanted, and then all of a sudden those progesterone levels are still high, and the female doesn't have her menstrual cycle, and she realizes, oh, I might be pregnant, and that first month has already happened. So generally speaking, we consider a full pregnancy term 9 months because the first one already happened after you found out. That brings me to postnatal. This is after birth. Development continues with various parts of the body growing at different rates. This is going to be super obvious with puberty, but the rate of growth and development during infancy is astounding, right? The amount of growth and development that occurs in the first 4 years of life is it rivals the development that occurs during puberty. Those are the two most active growth periods of your lifetime. Aging simply refers to the development of changes that occur naturally over the course of time. So hormone levels change, organ activities and metabolic rates change over the course of your life. We think of the stages of life, we like to identify them as infancy, then you have toddlers, then you have preteen, you have teen, and then you have adult. Generally, those are the stages that we identify during your life. Now, during the infancy period, you still rely on mom for food. This is breastfeeding and nutrients. As you become a toddler, now you're moving around and you're eating solid foods. You're eating regular foods, I should say, because you eat solid food in infancy too. Sorry. And then once you get to the preteen and teen, you're essentially independent. You're still relying on your parents to provide for you. Let's talk about external development on land. For other organisms. So we have internal development. We develop inside the uterus. All mammals do that. but lots of organisms do external development on land. These organisms need to lay an egg or create an egg for survival. The egg structure is outlined here. You have a hard, or at least generally more rigid outer shell. I say generally because birds lay eggs that have calcium in them, but if you look at reptiles like alligators and turtles, they actually lay soft shells and they're more leathery in nature. They have a yolk. The yellow yolk are the nutrients that are provided for the developing embryo, and the embryo will utilize those for nutrients. Any wastes that are produced are going to collect in the allantois, and the allantois is going to collect the metabolic wastes, which are nitrogenous wastes. But I will also say there is a membrane on the inside of the egg. All right, the inside of the egg has a membrane as well, and gases actually pass through that membrane and dissolve in the albumin. The albumin is the liquid portion of the egg, or I should say colorless, the white of the egg. And then you have the chorion, which is that outer membrane that surrounds the other membranes. All right, and I highlighted that here. Right. All nutrients and materials have to be provided. There's no support from mom other than putting this egg into a position where it can survive. Often that'll be putting it into a nest, or they'll bury it in the sand. Burying it in the sand helps to regulate temperature, and that's important for reptile development, actually. Temperature regulation of eggs as they develop for reptiles has an influence on gender development. Organisms that live near water, the eggs of many fish, amphibians, they're fertilized externally. Amphibians, we're talking about like salamanders or frogs. They will lay eggs and males will fertilize them outside the body, and they will develop outside the body. There's typically huge numbers of sex cells produced because a lot of them will die. This has to do with predation and vulnerability because they don't typically receive a whole lot of support. The source of food for the development is still, just like in the bird egg that we showed on the previous slide, is the yolk inside of it, but they are going to be born significantly underdeveloped. So they're not going to be born in a position where they're going to be highly competitive. It's one of the reasons why they make so many of them. Little tiny eggs with very little support, they're going to be very vulnerable. So that's in water. You also have in land. On land, you have the eggs of birds, reptiles, and a few mammals. That's going to be included in that duck-billed platypus video down here. We'd like to have you click on from the electronic document. Very interesting. But they still produce a yolk as a food source, and they tend to have hard shells. But as I mentioned earlier, the reptiles do produce leathery, softer shells, but they still provide protection, and they're typically tended to for a short period of time. Birds tend to tend their eggs a little bit more. If you've watched the Penguins movie, then you've seen a little bit about how Penguins happen to be very tentative, or excuse me, not tentative, attentive parents, and they tend to their eggs for a long time because they live in a very harsh climate. Organisms that develop internally include the placental mammals. That's us, all right, humans and other animals. The placental mammals have exchange of nutrients, and this is long-term care and development. So there tend to be fewer offspring because you expend so much time and energy to ensure the survival of your offspring. So placental mammals will have fewer babies than the reptiles, birds, etc. And then marsupials are the mammals that do internal fertilization, and they have partial internal development. They climb into a pouch and attach to a nipple that's inside the pouch that provides nutrition for the underdeveloped baby. And then as that baby develops inside the pouch, it will gradually, it'll make its way out. There is a video included here to show kangaroo birth, which is the first opportunity for a baby kangaroo to come out of a pouch. But it also talks about how that underdeveloped fetus makes its way into the pouch in the first place, which is no easy task. They have to climb out and in to the pouch. So it's pretty interesting to understand how that works. I hope that's been helpful. And if you have any questions or curious about any of those topics, by all means, catch up with your teachers. We'll answer any questions that you might have.